Take a moment to look down at what you're wearing right now. If you're like billions of people on this planet, there's a high probability you're wearing blue jeans. Now, slide your hand into the right front pocket. You'll feel it. That tiny, seemingly useless miniature pocket nestled just above the main opening. If you're lucky, maybe you've managed to squeeze a stray coin, a guitar pick, or a pair of wireless earbuds in there. But most of the time, it just sits there, empty. A bizarre, tiny architectural anomaly stitched into our daily clothing. And this raises a strange, almost unsettling question. Why do we, citizens of a hyper-modern, high-tech world, blindly accept the design choices made by people who have been dead for over a century? Why are we letting the physical limitations of the 1,870 seconds dictate the landscape of our clothing today? It turns out your pants are haunted. Haunted by the practical struggles of a world we've almost entirely forgotten. To understand why this tiny pocket exists, we have to travel back in time, long before the era of smartphones, wristwatches, or even standardized time zones. Let's wind the clock back to the late 19th century. Picture the rugged, unforgiving environments of the American West. Dusty mines, expanding railroads, and dense timberlands. The people building this world were manual laborers, miners, railroad workers, carpenters, and cowboys. For these workers, time wasn't just an abstract concept. It was a matter of coordination, safety, and survival. But they didn't have wristwatches. In the 1,870 seconds, wristwatches were considered highly delicate, feminine accessories, far too fragile for a man splitting logs or digging for silver. Instead, working-class men relied on pocket watches, round, heavy pieces of glass and brass. But how do you carry a fragile pocket watch when your daily job involves swinging a sledgehammer or riding a bucking horse? If you kept it in your shirt pocket, it would fall out the moment you bent over. If you kept it in a vest, the chain could easily catch on heavy machinery, dragging you into a mechanical nightmare. Enter a Bavarian immigrant named Levi Strauss. In the early 1,870 seconds, his company, Levi Strauss & Company, was selling what they called waist overalls, the garment we now call jeans. Levi noticed the workers' dilemma and integrated a highly specific solution. He added a tiny pocket just above the main front right pocket. It wasn't a coin pocket. In the original company catalogs, it was officially designated as the watch pocket. Its dimensions were calculated to be incredibly precise. The pocket was designed so that a standard-issue working man's pocket watch would slide in and sit so snugly against the hip that it couldn't bounce around, slip out, or get scratched by other tools. It was, in essence, the very first protective case for a mobile tech gadget. And here's a detail that might break your perception of the classic five-pocket jeans. Historically, this tiny pocket wasn't the fifth pocket at all. When the first patented blue jeans were released in 1873, they only had 4 pockets, 2 in the front, the tiny watch pocket, and just one single pocket on the back right. The second rear pocket didn't appear until 1901. So, every time you wear jeans, you are carrying a dedicated holster for a piece of 19th century mechanical technology that you almost certainly do not own. It is a beautiful, silent tribute to the railroad workers and miners of the Gilded Age. But the watch pocket is only half the mystery. If we look closely at this tiny pocket, and indeed at the corners of all the other pockets on your jeans, we find another relic. Those tiny metallic copper buttons. The rivets. Popular folklore tells us these metal studs were put there to stop the pockets from ripping open under the immense weight of heavy gold nuggets found by lucky prospectors during the gold rush. It's a romantic, cinematic image. But the real story is much more grounded in everyday human struggle, and it centers on a brilliant yet deeply impoverished tailor who was so broke he almost let the invention of the century slip right through his fingers. Let's address the gold rush myth first. The idea of rugged men carrying heavy, sparkling chunks of gold in their pockets until the seams burst makes for a great Hollywood scene. But gold is incredibly rare, and very few miners were walking around with pockets heavy enough to tear heavy denim. The reality of physical destruction was far more mundane, yet far more relentless. It was about everyday iron, wood, and sweat. The true genius behind the metal studs on your jeans wasn't a corporate executive or a wealthy industrialist in a San Francisco high-rise. It was an immigrant tailor named Jacob Davis. Born Jazips Jufis in the Russian Empire, he journeyed to America in search of the classic promise of opportunity. By 1870, he found himself in the gritty, dusty town of Reno, Nevada. Davis wasn't designing high fashion. He ran a humble tailor shop, sewing functional, heavy-duty gear, tents, wagon covers, horse blankets, and rugged work pants for local laborers. Reno was a town built on hard labor, railroads, timber, and mining, and Davis's customers were tough, physically active men who pushed their clothing to the absolute limit. But these men had a constant, incredibly frustrating problem. The pockets of their work trousers kept tearing. When a lumberjack or a miner stuffed heavy metal wrenches, iron nails, or jagged rock samples into their pockets, gravity and leverage went to work. The weakest points of any trousers are the corners of the pockets and the base of the fly, where different pieces of fabric meet and tension is concentrated. One sharp tug or one heavy tool, and the thread would snap, rendering the pocket useless. The wives of these workers were tired of constantly mending their husbands' trousers. In late 1870, the wife of a local woodcutter approached Davis with a specific plea. She wanted a pair of work pants for her husband that wouldn't fall apart in the first week. She was willing to pay, but she needed something structurally superior. As Davis sat in his workshop, surrounded by heavy canvas and leather, his eyes fell upon the hardware he used to make horse blankets and carriage harnesses. Specifically, small copper rivets. In the equestrian world, these rivets were used to join thick leather straps together under immense tension. Davis had a sudden flash of inspiration. If these copper studs could hold a horse's harness together under the strain of pulling heavy wagons, why couldn't they do the same for a man's trousers? He took the woodcutter's pants, placed a small copper rivet at the corner of each pocket and at the base of the fly, and hammered them shut. It was a crude industrial modification, but when the woodcutter put them on, the results were nothing short of miraculous. The pants didn't rip. Word spread fast through Reno. Suddenly, every laborer in town wanted Davis's pants. Davis realized he was sitting on a massive opportunity. He needed to patent this invention immediately before someone else copied it. But here, the harsh reality of being a poor immigrant struck. Registering a patent with the United States Patent Office cost exactly $68. Today that might sound like a cheap dinner, but in 1872, $68 was a small fortune for a struggling local tailor, roughly equivalent to nearly $2,000 today. Davis simply didn't have the cash. He was trapped by his own poverty, holding an invention that could change the world, but unable to afford the piece of paper to prove it was his. Desperate and running out of time, Davis decided to write a letter. He addressed it to his fabric supplier in San Francisco, a successful wholesale dry goods merchant named Levi Strauss. Davis laid out his idea, proposing a partnership where Strauss would pay the patent fee and they would share the rights. But Davis was taking a massive gamble. He was revealing his secret to a powerful businessman who could easily steal the idea and leave the poor tailor with nothing. What did Davis write in that fateful letter, and how did Levi Strauss react? When Levi Strauss received Jacob Davis's letter in his San Francisco office, he didn't dismiss it as the ramblings of a small-town tailor. Strauss was a merchant with a sharp eye for utility. He recognized that Davis's invention solved the single greatest complaint about workwear at the time. He accepted the partnership immediately, agreeing to pay the fees and manage the legal paperwork. On May 21,873, the United States Patent Office officially granted Jacob Davis and Levi Strauss & Company patent number 139,121 for an improvement in fastening pocket openings. This date is celebrated today as the official birthday of the blue jeans. But if you look at the technical drawing attached to that historic document, you realize something profound. This wasn't a patent for fashion or style. It was a patent for an engineering breakthrough. To appreciate why this was so revolutionary, we have to look at the physics of fabric. When you pull on a piece of woven cotton denim, the force of that pull is distributed relatively evenly across the individual threads. However, at a corner where two seams meet, or where a pocket opening is stitched, that force ceases to be distributed. Instead, all of the kinetic energy and tension gets concentrated onto a tiny, highly localized point. In engineering, this is called stress concentration. Think of it like trying to tear a piece of paper. If you pull on a flat sheet of paper from both ends, it's surprisingly strong. But if you make a tiny nick in the edge and pull, all the force concentrates at the very tip of that nick, and the paper tears effortlessly. Thread, no matter how thick, eventually snaps under this concentrated stress. But a copper rivet changes the entire equation. By hammering a solid metal post through the layers of denim and securing it with a washer, Davis changed how force traveled through the garment. The stress was no longer resting on a fragile cotton thread. Instead, the physical load was transferred onto the rigid metal rivet. The rivet acted like a tiny, load-bearing pillar, diffusing the kinetic energy across a much wider surface area of the fabric. This simple piece of physics transformed the industry. Laborers no longer had to constantly repair or replace their workwear. Levi Strauss's waist overalls became the standard of durability. The company grew rapidly, fueled by the sheer engineering superiority of their product. They were selling a high-performance tool, not just clothing. Yet, as perfect as this engineering marvel seemed, it was still subject to the unpredictable nature of real-world use. Because when you place hard, conductive metal rivets on a garment meant to be worn close to the human body, you introduce unexpected and sometimes painful variables. In fact, one of these shiny copper rivets was placed in a spot so highly sensitive, so incredibly intimate, that it took a painful incident involving the head of the company himself to realize they had made a terrible design mistake. For nearly 7 decades, the architecture of the blue jean remained relatively unchanged. But those early designs possessed a major, painful flaw, specifically located in the crotch area. To keep the fly seam secure, the original patent included a copper rivet placed right at the very base of the button fly, directly between the wearer's legs. In theory, it made sense. Keep the high-tension seam from ripping when a worker bent over. But copper is an exceptional conductor of heat. In 1941, Walter Haas, then the president of Levi Strauss & Company, was on a camping trip in the American wilderness. After a long day of hiking, he sat down close to a roaring campfire to relax and warm up. As Haas sat by the fire, the open flames began to heat the copper rivet on his fly. Copper has a thermal conductivity rate roughly 20 times higher than stainless steel. It didn't take long for the rivet to absorb the thermal energy of the fire, superheating in a matter of minutes. When Haas shifted his weight, the scorching hot piece of metal pressed directly against his skin. The reaction was immediate and incredibly painful. Haas reportedly leaped up in agony. As soon as he returned to the corporate headquarters in San Francisco, he ordered that the crotch rivet be permanently removed from all future designs. But that wasn't the only problematic rivet. The original patent also placed copper studs on the corners of the back pockets. This worked beautifully for miners sitting on raw stone, but as jeans transitioned from the mines into everyday civilian life, a new set of problems emerged. People began sitting on wooden school desks, plush leather car seats, and expensive leather horse saddles. The exposed metal rivets acted like tiny carving knives, scratching, tearing, and gouging every surface they brushed against. School boards complained, furniture manufacturers were frustrated, and cowboys found their expensive saddles ruined. Levi Strauss & Company had to adapt. In 1937, they tried a clever workaround. They covered the back pocket rivets with denim, sewing them under the fabric. These were known as hidden rivets. But eventually, as the fabric wore thin, the metal would still poke through and cause damage. Ultimately, the solution didn't come from metallurgy, but from textile technology. Industrial sewing machines became advanced enough to perform a bar tack, a tight, heavy, zigzag stitch that binds fabric together so tightly it mimics the strength of metal. This reinforcement stitch allowed designers to remove the back pocket rivets entirely. By the mid-20th century, the original structural reasons for both the watch pocket and the copper rivets had completely evaporated. We had wristwatches, then smartphones. We had modern high-tensile synthetic threads and bar-tack sewing techniques that made metal reinforcement obsolete. And yet, if you look at the jeans you are wearing right now, those rivets are still there. They are still stamped into the denim. The tiny watch pocket is still sewn into the seam. Why? Why does a multi-billion-dollar global fashion industry continue to spend millions of dollars keeping these relics alive? What is the hidden psychological force keeping these relics alive? To find the answer, we have to look at a concept in design known as skeuomorphism. Skeuomorphism occurs when a newly designed object retains physical or visual features from an older version that are no longer functionally necessary. Think of the digital world, the trash can icon on your computer desktop, or the synthetic shutter sound of your silent smartphone camera. Or look at the digital notepad app with fake yellow lines and a leather-textured margin. None of these need to look or sound like their physical ancestors to work, but they do. Why? Because human psychology is deeply resistant to sudden change. We need familiar, visual bridges to help us transition into the future. Jeans are perhaps the ultimate physical example of skeuomorphism in the history of fashion. If a manufacturer tried to sell a pair of denim pants today without the watch pocket or the copper rivets, most consumers would look at them and feel that something was deeply wrong. They wouldn't look like real jeans. They would look imitation, cheap, or unfinished. Over the course of 150 years, we have built a powerful psychological association between the visual presence of copper rivets and the concept of rugged, authentic quality. The rivets aren't holding the fabric together anymore. They are holding our trust in the product together. But there is a deeper, almost philosophical layer to this. We live in an increasingly abstract, digital, and intangible world. Much of our daily lives happens behind glass screens. We tap on pixels, we send emails, we manipulate data. Our labor is often invisible, and our lives can feel detached from physical reality. In this context, denim is a form of tactile grounding. When we pull on a pair of heavy denim pants, feel the cold touch of the copper rivets, and run our fingers over the edge of the watch pocket, we are wrapping ourselves in the aesthetic of physical labor. We are buying into the myth of the rugged pioneer, the hard-working miner, the builder of railroads. We are paying for a physical connection to an era when things were made of wood, iron, and stone. It was a time when durability could be measured by a solid metal stud. The watch pocket and the copper rivets are no longer tools of survival. They are tools of nostalgia. They are physical anchors designed to keep us connected to a past we never actually experienced, helping us navigate a future we don't fully understand. Our modern lives are filled with these quiet compromises, invisible threads of history, woven into our most ordinary habits. So the next time you put on your favorite pair of jeans, reach into your pocket and feel that tiny, empty watch pocket. Take a moment to reflect. What other invisible rivets from the 19th century are silently holding together the structure of your modern life? What other ghosts are you carrying in your pockets, completely unaware of how they are shaping your world today? The history of design is the history of us.